I'm so happy to have this discussion along with Mr. A.S. Panneerselvan, the senior journalist, a well-known journalist, and now the author of this wonderful book, Karunanidhi, A Life. So I thought I will ask certain questions and lead this discussion towards a better understanding of this book and of course, about the life of Dr. Karunanidhi himself. To begin with, I mean, you have already mentioned, Mr. Pugar, about the quotes of N. Ram and how his life, he has negotiated several things, and just as a sequel to that, I would like to pick up a quote from A.S. Panneerselvan himself in this book, where he says, in a state where language, empowerment, self-respect, art and literary forms and films coalesce with each other to give political vibrancy, Karunanidhi's life becomes a sort of natural metaphor of modern Tamil Nadu. His multifaceted personality helped to understand the organic evolution of the Dravidian movement. So I was wondering, from this quote, this book, in a way, is about, of course, it's about the life of Karunanidhi. It's also about the history of DMK. It's also about the history of Dravidian movement. But I want to ask Panneer how he, brought these things together, to blend these things together, because it's a real challenge, to write a biography of such a tall leader like Dr. Karunanidhi, because he had a complete life. So I wanted to ask him what led him to do this and how long it took for him to write
Thank you, Sundar. Actually, this question has two elements. One is, how did I come to make a history of the movement into the way to arrive at that conclusion? I wanted to write a book on the self-respect movement when India liberalized in 1991. I wanted to understand what will be the place for a movement which was looking at affirmative action when market is going to be the biggest arbitrator of people's life. And that was around the time when Soviet Union collapsed and people are talking about the end of the history. Well, I wanted to look at the Dravidian movement from that point of view. But 10 years of work trying to address that question, I came to a conclusion that instead of addressing this issue through a complex political party or a political movement's viewpoint, it answers itself very well if I focus on an individual who becomes a metaphor for this movement. And Kalaignar becomes a natural metaphor for the movement. Kalaignar becoming the natural metaphor for the movement also gets highlighted because 10 years after my initial work, the exact date in which I decided to make it a biography on Kalaignar was the infamous midnight arrest. That day I said, no, I'm not going to write about the movement. I'm going to write about the man. And through the man, I'm going to understand what happened in the state over the past 80, 90 years. That's how that shift happened. There were 3 or 4 major challenges. First is everybody associated with Dravidian movement happened to be has been such a huge prolific writer. He had written about nearly 3 lakh pages of words. If you're going to put all his writing together, it comes to 3 lakh pages of words. And then it's 100 volumes of Anna's writing. As Tirunavakar rightly points out in his book on the history of the Dravidian movement, and nearly 250 journals have been published. Given this prolific outpouring from this movement, to cull out certain and to leave out some becomes a big task. Essential tools I used is that I'm not going to address this for the people who know about the movement, but I'm going to take up the issues which are not known to outsiders. Therefore, essentially the target audience was not Tamil-speaking people, but the target audience were people who are interested in knowing why Tamil Nadu behaves in a particular manner. Why is Tamil Nadu an enigma for those people? Especially after 1967, the trajectory what the state has taken has become an enigma for some people. But if you are reading the state very closely and carefully, nothing is really enigmatic. Everything is very, very clear. It answers itself. Therefore, I wanted to pull out those elements which answers the trajectory of the state. And that's how the book has been constructed. If I had to do a fair work for Kalaignar, like what happened with Gandhi, with K. Swaminathan, where it had become a 100-volume collected works of Gandhi with annotations, I also need to do at least a 50 or 20-volume work for Kalaignar. But that is beyond the scope of this book, because this book is aimed at reaching out to others and to explain what were the political compulsions and how they negotiated these compulsions. During this entire journey, what fascinated me was very, very clear idea of the leader as well as a statesman in Kalaignar, which came out. That is, he made this vital distinction between what is compromise and what is conciliation. Today, a lot of people are not able to understand that fine distinction what he made. There were lots of conciliation, but there were no compromise. That is the crucial learning what I got out from reading his life. And unless and otherwise you have conciliation, there is no progression. But if you are going to compromise, then you don't need a movement. Therefore, if you need a movement, and if that movement has to deliver, that movement needs to know where are the spaces for negotiation and where are the places for conciliation. And I thought that his writing, his speeches, the way he used theater, the way he used his proscenium dialogues brought out that space. And hence, that was the most learning experience of doing writing this biography.
Thank you, Pandit. That was very interesting, because several people have written biographies, and it would be a real challenge to make it rather complete. But I'm sure this is much more comprehensive when compared to other things. And the way you have constructed this book is you have used different types of sources. I'll come to that in a moment. But I also wanted to, while reading this book, I was really intrigued by this idea at what inspired you when you wrote this book, especially when you use Gerald Martin's biography of Gabriel Garcia Marquez. So can you elaborate something about that? I mean, you also present his the idea of three lives that everyone has. So can you please elaborate about that?
People go for it becomes a compendium of both the dairy as well as opinions. Then there is also historical biographies which people have written, which takes a slightly different turn. I wanted to take Marquez because Marquez, at some level, exemplified the politics of the Latin America as well as the creative energy of the Latin America. Though Marquez was never a ruler, Marquez had a huge political influence. Marquez was very close to people like Castro. Marquez played a big role in Latin American political solidarity. What I thought is Marquez gave life, the way Gerald Martin handled it, gave me a entry point to do this work, because the most defining element for me in the Gerald Martin's biography of Marquez is that it gave the politics of the Latin America, and it located almost every work of Marquez within that politics. Therefore, the politics of the terrain becomes very, very important. Hence, I thought that that was an easy method for me to follow. Marcus and Martin had a range of interactions, and when one of the interactions, Marcus says, his biographer, that every human being has three lives: a private life, a public life, and a secret life. Then Martin asks him, "Will you share your secret life?" He says, "No, it's for you to find out." And he smiles and he leaves it at that. When I explained this to Kalanger, that they were discussing about the three lives, he said that if you're a political leader or if you're a person who have written an autobiography, then you actually have four lives. He said public life, private life, secret life, and a life which you wished you lived. And he says that almost every autobiography has that element. Again, I asked him, will he help me to locate those things within Ninjakinidi? Like Marcus, he smiled and he said, it's for me to find out. Therefore, in that sense, engaging with him was always a fascinating element. Certain things are too difficult to translate quickly. For instance, in 2002, he wrote this letter to Prime Minister Vajpayee asking for him to declare Tamil as a classical language. It's a long letter. I had the opportunity of translating it. There was a two-line Tamil sentence. It took nearly a week for me to come up with a proper translation, because it said that வகுத்தலும் மட்டுமல்லாமல் தொகுத்தலும் இருக்கிற இந்த மொழியில் அமைதி என்பதின் மூலம் எந்த பாகுபாடும் நிரந்தரமான பாகுபாடாக இல்லை. It actually captures the entire history of the Tamil literature. Therefore, the categorization from Agam Puram, from all the Tinais, which is Vagupu, then these Vagupu into Togupu, which means you collect, you divide, you add, and you bring in an element called Varu Amaidi, அல்லது Mayakam. Through this, none has been extremely rigid. There is a flexibility. There is an inherent flexibility there. Now, to translate this and to capture that entire 2,000 years history of the language becomes challenge. Therefore, for me as a biographer, the biggest challenge was to capture certain nuances. I don't think I managed to capture all those things, but I think I managed to give a glimpse into the world of Kalinger's idea of words and literature, as well as polity and language.
Yeah, this is very interesting. You said you looked at using the lens of Agam and Puram, and that's how you also constructed this book. So can you provide a few elements of this Agam and Puram aspects of his life?
See, in Tamil classical one, Agam does not even have the name of the people. Therefore, we respect privacy so much. Therefore, it becomes he and she. And within he and she, the most important aspect is negotiating humiliation and negotiating pain, negotiating loss. Therefore, that early phase when his wife Padma was undergoing that downhill health condition, when he was not able to provide her with necessary medical help, which is essentially a personal loss, it's a agam. But it gets Puram when he becomes a chief minister. Some of the welfare measures flows from the agam experiences of the humiliation, of the sense of loss, of the lack of opportunities. Therefore, all the agam experiences gets crystallized as policy when it comes to Puram. One of the reasons why I looked at his life a bit closely, especially till he becomes a deputy leader of the DMK in the assembly, that is in 1962, you see a particular trajectory in his agam that informs his policy making much later. Where the pain becomes a idea how to address PDS, how to create a state which is responsive to people's need.
Thank you. Now, you have used, as I said, this bibliography is very extensive. From his own autobiography, you have used other sources to provide corroborative evidences, and you have listed all the events and provided historical information, the background to all of that, and you also placed some contextually. But I want to ask you, how his creative forms and the political form, how he used this creative form in the political arena, and how was this used as a tool for the propagation of Dravidian movement?
See, Kalinger's creativity has not been really properly evaluated. In fact, the Dravidian movement creators' work itself, I don't think has been properly evaluated. For the left, the IPTA has been studied extensively. Compared to what reading material we have about IPTA, we don't have much about the Dravidian movement's creative tools. But their creative tools have a very, very interesting hybrid culture. They pick up something and they transform it. Therefore, their idea is to pick up something which is in the popular imagination and then transform it. For instance, even a film like Malaikallan is from a person from the nationalist movement. It's Namakal Kavingar's work. Therefore, you pick up something like Malaikallan and transform it into a Dravidian movement work. You pick up Silapadikaram and convert it into a Dravidian movement work. The idea is to pick up something which is there in the popular imagination and use that as an entry point to drive home your politics as well as your end desired goal. But in that sense, the Dravidian movement's idea of picking it up and transforming, I don't call them as adaptation because they are not adapting them literally. They take it, but they just pick up one element, which is the entry point, and then they transform it completely. Even, for instance, that Pammal Sambandhamudaliyar's monograph, the way Kalaignar has handled it, and the way Pammal Sambandhamudaliyar has handled it, there's no link between the two. But only thing is, Pammal Sambandhamudaliyar's monograph had certain resonance among the people. The way you pick up things which had resonance, use that as an entry point, transform your narrative. That was a key element in his literary approach.
Well, talking about his creative forms, the films like Malaikallan or Manohara or Pumbuhar, he has consciously used certain areas of topics, but he has consciously also avoided certain things. What are those things that he has avoided? For instance, let me be very direct about mythology, or how he uses mythology to strengthen the idea of Dravidian movement, and also how he uses films like Pumbuhar to strengthen the ideas of Dravidian movement.
With reference to mythology, they had a much clearer idea by 40s. In fact, in 1948, when Pulavar Kulandai's Ravana Kavyam comes out, Anna writes a very, very fascinating critical review of Ravana Kavyam. In the introduction to Ravana Kavyam, Anna clearly says that இது ராமர்களுக்கு காவியத்திற்கான பதில் என்பதில் எந்த விதமான மாற்றமும் இல்லை. ஆனால் நாங்கள் ராவணதாசர்களுக்கு பதில் ராவணதாசர்களாக யாரும் மாற வேண்டும் என்று கூறவில்லை. ராமர் எப்படி கற்பனை பாத்திரமோ அதே போல ராவணனும் கற்பனை பாத்திரம் என்பது எங்களுக்கு தெரியும். Okay, now this is the most crucial one. They approached it with a very, very clear idea of the epics were creation of human beings. They did not convert the epics into either history or divine given. And hence that template which was given in the introduction for Ravana Kavyam defined their approach to almost every mythological work as well as Tamil epics. In fact, if we are looking at Kalingar's early work, they were all from those Aimperum Kappiyam, and all the Aimperum Kappiyams, as we know, are clearly in the Buddhist or Jainist text. The idea of taking Buddhist or Jainist text is to confront a certain amount of orthodoxy, which is flowing from rigid Hindutva. Though we never had it as Hindutva here, the rigidity of the religion was quite obvious. Creative people we have come across. He has a special place for NSK. He wrote for NSK's film called Panam. NSK got him the first car. These are all well known. And it was NSK who first paid him a humongous fees of 10,000. 10,000 at the time is really a big, big fees. I don't know whether we really understand the quantum of that money today. But apart from all these things, NSK played a big role in telling him, move to Chennai. You have to be in Chennai to practice your art as well as to sharpen your politics. The way 1915, when Kalingar moves to Chennai, it is essentially because of NSK's compulsion and clarity. And within a year of coming to Chennai, Kalingar says that NSK proved right. Because most of the studios moved to Chennai. Chennai emerged as not only the political capital, but also the cultural capital. In that sense, NSK becomes a guiding principle for him. And most interesting thing, what NSK told him is that everybody keeps talking about tragedies and tragedies' power to inform. But it is the comedies which have the power not only to inform, but also to implement. That's how comedy becomes so important for them, because that was a very, very interesting distinction what NSK had in his mind. NSK says that the most poignant tragedy can inform, but a profound comedy can not only inform, but can also transform. And NSK performed at Kalingar's wedding and the performance was Kindan Kadai. And Kindan Kadai, in a sense, again, it deals with all the things what we spoke over the last 20-25 minutes. That is how to bring in a mythological one and transform it completely. Therefore, Nandan becomes Kindan, and Kindan's idea of final liberation is becoming a student. Therefore, Kindan is fighting for the entry not into the temple, but Kindan was fighting for an entry into the school. Therefore, knowledge was seen as the final liberating destination. So I think NSK becomes so important for him, and he played a big role in 1968 in erecting NSK statue in Madras. In fact, that was the last public event attended by Anna, despite his failing health. Anna comes and opens it. And the way it comes, and when Kalinga becomes a chief minister, he names a public theater, the children's theater, as Kalaivanar Arangam. Therefore, it's a much more organic relationship. And through NSK and TA Muduram, he also understood other forms of art. In fact, through them, he met people like Dhanapal. And in fact, his relationship with Dhanapal, which happened through NSK, later transformed into the public art along the Marina Promenade. Therefore, all that statues, what we see, is a product of his relationship with Mr. Dhanapal.
That's very interesting. You're talking about the promenade on the Marina. And so it was also the outcome of during the first, the Tamil World Conference that took place in Chennai. How would you see the first World Conference that he was majorly responsible? I think Anna had given, he was his Lieutenant General for Anna, and therefore he had to organize everything. So how would you see that Tamil Conference and the last Tamil Conference that he organized in Coimbatore?
See, luckily, 1968 conference did not get into any forms of politics. It was free from the politics, hence it remains a major development even in people's memory. By 2011, 2010, International Tamil Conference had got into politics. That is an unfortunate development. In fact, the one person who really understood the importance of that conference was George Hart, because when he came here, he said that it's an unnecessary politicization. Everybody should have embraced this event, because this event is celebrating Tamil in such a way where there's a public participation. The investment is not an individual's investment. Investment is the most generous collective investment. Therefore, that is the difference. Barring that difference, I don't see much difference in this approach. Certain things evolved over the time. For instance, the number of tableaus which had come up in Coimbatore were expanded. Those are all, I think, as a natural expansions. Well, whatever started in Chennai in 68 bloomed into something much more significant, much more vibrant by 2010. But in 2010, if it had not been politicized, I think it would have generated far better resonance.
I was saying it has been 14, he has been 5 times chief minister.
Yes, sir.
And so many years in politics, in his political career. Anna was there just for a few years, and it has to be Kalaignar who had to bear this entire burden on his shoulders to lead this party and keep it intact for so many years, and the legacy continues. That one, it's good on one side, but I wanted to know, it also he has faced these challenges of 4 times split. How did he manage? Which split was very crucial and which was very challenging for him? And how did he actually manage? How did you get evidences for writing about this, that how he managed these conflicts, these important events?
The best thing which have happened for the Dravidian movement is that everybody had been vocal about their own position and they documented their viewpoints. Therefore, the moment you have these two contested narratives in your hand, you can read them together and identify where the fault line lies. For instance, Sambat, EVK Sambat, that has been extremely prolific. In fact, he was using Kannadasan's Tendril to write about his differences. There were all the differences between Sambat and the party, leading to his split, him walking out and forming his own party in 61. It's been documented both in Murasoli as well as in Tendril. All you need to do is to place these two things simultaneously and start reading it simultaneously. And then you will recognize the fault lines. Then you know that these fault lines are verifiable, because the moment you identify the fault line and you see, the problem is when you are interviewing people, especially the leaders, they talk in general terms. But with reference to the specific fault lines, it is important for the biographer to locate them. In the case of Sambat versus DMK, the finest fault line was pointed out by Mr. V.R. Nedunjarian in his Dravidian Varlaru, which was published immediately 6 months after the split. He says that Sambat has been accusing party of backing film personalities, but Sambat wants to write only in Kannadasan's Tendril. Isn't Kannadasan a film personality or not? Therefore, the way these people came up with their counter questions, the finer questions, helps us to understand the fault lines. Sundar, again, you have been muted.
Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. I was wondering, the split when MGR left DMK, was that not really crucial because it kept DMK out of office for several years?
Okay. When I am reading all these documents, 1972 split becomes extremely important because that helped the state to retain its political center within the state. While we can argue about all the problems which are coming from ADMK, we should also consider the fact that the emergence of ADMK has kept the national parties at bay. Therefore, in my personal opinion, the 1972 split as well as the 1978 attempt by Mr. Biju Patnaik to unite these two parties, the failure of Mr. Biju Patnaik as a blessing for the state. And ADMK, even for this election, the 2021 election, just look at the development. ADMK lifted substantial portions from the DMK's manifesto. And Kamal Hassan's party lifts substantial portion from the BJP. Therefore, having a pale DMK, having a weak DMK, having a DMK which is not so assertive is not a bad option. To keep this party within the larger position of having a state party has helped the state. Yes, of course, it robbed DMK 10 crucial years. The 77-87 could have been a transformative period. We failed. In fact, that during the 10 years, the only substantial development was universalization of the nutritious noon meal scheme. That was a very, very important one, and that stands out. But barring that, we are not able to identify a single defining program. Therefore, loss of a decade is a big issue. In fact, we lost 2 decades because of ADMK. First was 77-87, and second is 2011-2021. 2011 to 2021. Therefore, these loss of 2 decades is an issue. I'm not denying that. But despite that loss, state gained by not having somebody who is going to be in a completely opposite direction. That I think is very, very important at some level.
You interestingly talked about conciliation, not about compromise. You chose consciously using, because that is what really defined Kalaignar. How did he reconcile with the moves of Vaiko after the split?
See, the Vaiko is the most classic case where Vaiko, after the split, endorsed all the decisions taken by Kalaignar earlier. First, in 89, Kalaignar gives him Sivakasi seat. He was defeated by Kalimuthu in Sivakasi. And he says that if I had have been given some other seat, I would have won. But when he forms his own party, he goes and he contests from the same seat. Starting from this, look at all the moves you have done. Vaiko endorsed Kalaigner's positions of all the stands he had taken earlier. That's the reason the 93 split did not affect the DMK at all. In fact, the split happened in 93. The next election was in 1996. DMK manages to sweep. And look at Mr. Vaiko today. Vaiko is contesting 6 seats in the DMK symbol, which means that circle has come that circle has been completed, and I don't see major challenge which had come from that split. And that is possible primarily because of Kalaignar's inherent space for conciliation. If that space had been contested, if that place had no space for reconciliation, this would not have happened. You need the space for conciliation. You need the space for somebody who is not towing your line fully to come back. Therefore, the creation of that space has been central to Kalaigner's politics. And that central space, what he had created, is being vindicated in 2021 elections.
Yeah, we see that. But how did the other states, other leaders, especially from the north of India, look at the whole idea of Dravidian movement and the idea of this man, Karunanidhi? How did they see the political progress of this nation state, especially with the formation after emergency, the formation of National Front and so on?
See, in classical political science method, there are 2 ways for a nation to come together. One is called coming together, another one is called holding together. In this 2 trajectories, Kalaignar exemplified coming together idea. Therefore, if you want to look at as federal positions or the way you wanted the center-state relationship to be evolved, or the fiscal federal arrangements should be encapsulated. What you see is a very, very clear desire of coming together rather than holding together. Therefore, the fulcrum is a voluntary sharing of the space rather than a forceful sharing of the space. And this is not being really understood by people in Delhi fully. Luckily for Kalaignar, for at each stage, he was able to identify one person with whom he could share these ideas and with whom he could get the backing. For instance, in Mrs. Indira Gandhi's early cabinet, Babu Jaijeevan Ram backed him fully. In fact, if you are looking at the interactions between Kalinger as the chief minister and the union cabinet ministers. His first trip to Delhi as a chief minister happens in 69, immediately after coming to power. And there he contrasts two interactions. First interaction was with the deputy prime minister and finance minister, Mr. Morarji Desai. And the next interaction was with Babu Jagjeevan Ram. With Morarji Desai, it was a dominance-dependency relationship. With Babu Jagjeevan Ram, it was a shared idea of empowering people. Therefore, whomever had come up with the idea of empowering people realized certain elements of Kalinger's politics. Not all, but certain elements. And that's what we see in his interaction with VP Singh, where it is far more clearer. His interaction with Punjab politicians, the Akalis, and the left leaders after 1977. In fact, the West Bengal government's 1977 proposal on center-state relations draws a lot from the early Dravidian movement's demands, including the demand of Rajamanar Committee report. Not fully, but certain elements. Therefore, to that extent, coming together as a political idea rather than holding together has been articulated extremely well, and VP Singh understood it fully. To some extent, the West Bengal CPM recognized it. And that's the reason in 1966, when he had an opportunity to work for the next Prime Minister of India, his first choice was VP Singh and second choice was Mr. Jyoti Basu. VP Singh declined because of his poor health, and Mr. Basu was denied that position by his party. That is a different story. But the fact that he chose these two people gives an idea of how we negotiated those difficult ideas outside Tamil Nadu.
Yeah. So with the formation of National Front, it actually gives, it gave a lot of hope for the idea of India, because coalition governments really worked well, especially for the growth of regionalism. So that is quite evident from what's happening today. Now, I would like to go to one important aspect about the Sri Lankan issue, where there's a lot of, when I read your book, it actually was an eye-opener for me, because you use this word fissiparous tendencies on the one side by the government and a sort of traitor by the sympathizers. How did he actually handle this issue? And it was really very challenging, because there's a kind of different kind of perception about the whole issue, about the position of DMK and about the position of Kalinger.
See, with Sri Lanka position, he was very, very clear. His sympathies were with the Tamils. And he has decided not to waver even a bit. He was not willing to buy the idea of sole representative of Tamils. He was not willing to buy the idea of either 100% result or not. Yes, and he was really moved by the plight of those people. The way he said that I'm not bothered about what Delhi or Colombo or LTT is going to think about me. I'm thinking about the welfare of the people. Those people are paying a huge price, and my concern is about their welfare. And he did not waver from it even a bit. A lot of people fail to understand that element of it, because he did not become a spokesperson of A or B or C or D. He did not become the spokesperson of the Indian government, because he was the only chief minister who refused to go and welcome an returning army. The way you can't say that he's a spokesperson of the deep Indian state. He was never a fan of the Singhala majoritarian tendencies. In fact, he had never met any one of those leaders. At the same time, he also did not endorse the idea of the sole representative. He said that you have the legitimate right to be the representative of the people. But the moment you say sole representative, you are denying democratic space for any people. And that is where Kalaignar becomes so different from all other Tamil leaders who are talking about the Tamil rights. They do not understand the reason for having the democratic space for others also to be representative and not to claim this idea of sole representative. There's fine distinction between having legitimate representational rights from being the sole representative is the one which really irritated the diaspora Tamils. Because the diaspora Tamils were the, what can I say, the mirror image of the Sinhala Buddhist majoritarianism. They wanted a singular position. Yeah. Now that 11 years have passed since that major tragedy, now the time has come for us to look at the need for the democratic space. And the need for the democratic space comes only when we recognize the distinction between legitimate representative and the sole representative.
Yeah, but this is very important that this is very well articulated in this book, because it really clarifies the position of DMK and of Kalaignar. And also it gives a complete perspective of the situation, why he did what he did. And at the same time, you also use this interesting metaphor of Arutpa and Marutpa. Can you throw some light on that?
See, there's one of the earliest, I don't know, we have people like poor ear lawyers, they should be able to pull out these case details. One of the earliest cases in the Madras High Court was filed by Arumuga Navalar against Vallallar's Arutpa. The argument in that case was that Arutpa were all written by the earlier saints. Now others are all lesser mortals. So the lesser, whatever has been produced by the lesser mortal, it can be only Marutpa or the song of ignorance. Whereas Arutpa is song of grace, and song of grace were over by 11th century. There were years a very, very clear year in which the songs of grace could be produced. That Marutpa has a very, very, what can I say, exacting standards. It has absolutely no space for vulnerabilities. It has no space for compromises. It has no space for conciliations. It is very, very exact. Compare that with Arutpa. Arutpa is full of spaces for vulnerabilities, weaknesses, reflections, and even changes. If you look at if we look at Vallallar's own trajectory from being a Saivite scholar to move to a position where he trusts only light, to come to this Arutperum Joji, Thaniperum Kadavul, that trajectory itself has the space for vulnerabilities. Vallallar's final position is about only two issues: hunger and illness. Noyatra Varvin an Vara Vendum, that becomes a key question. And at Vadalur, the key issue is the kitchen should be on every second. You cannot have the kitchen being closed. This element, from being in that sense, Marutpa is doctrinaire and Arutpa is humanitarian. That's a distinction I see. I see that are we going to approach the Sri Lankan issue from a doctrinaire position or from a humanitarian position?
Mr. Pugar, can we go on for a few more minutes? Is it okay, or?
Sir, we can go. We can go.
All right. Thank you. Pani, this is this was a very sharp pulling of ideas from our own tradition of, this idea of Marutpa and Arutpan, which he uses. I thought that was really brilliant, and in a sense, that also reflects the idea of the bipolar politics that we are facing. So now, there's one more crucial question that I wanted to ask was about the coalition politics. That's very important in electoral politics. What kind of negotiations that happen, and how is always being perceived by partners, whether the seats are given. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, something happened to my screen. I'm sorry. Yeah. So how did the parties look at when they were coming together for electoral politics? There was a lot of backstabbing. There was a lot of anxieties. There were all sorts of issues around seats being provided for coalition partners and not being given for them. How did he actually negotiate, and why did he negotiate in such a manner?
See, the most interesting element comes from the 1967 negotiations. At some level, the 1967 election happens to be the template through which DMK negotiates with its partners. In 1967, they had to negotiate with two really contesting ideas. One was Rajaji, who wanted very less of government. In fact, it was Rajaji's statement, less government, more governance. And then you have to deal with CPM, which wanted more centralization and more state-run enterprises. Therefore, it was more government of the left and no government of the right. And in between, DMK had to negotiate. And if you actually look at the 1967 statements, Anna and Kalaignar came out with a very, very interesting answer. They neither endorsed more government, nor did they endorse no government. They came up with good government. Therefore, there is a very, very interesting negotiating talent they had. And this negotiating talent gets reflected much later in 1988, 89, when the National Front is getting crystallized. Kalaignar was asked about this idea of what is the ideology of the National Front? Is it left or is it in the right? Kalaignar, who generally answers in Tamil, for a second stopped in Tamil and decided to answer in English. He said that, Mr. Reporter, as the name rightly suggests, we are neither left nor right. We are in the front. Therefore, there was a way in which the geography was inverted to address his concern at that point of time. And that's the reason this idea of CMP comes in. Right from 1967, wherever DMK had been in alliance, there has been a CMP, that is the Common Minimum Program. And that Common Minimum Program is a template to exemplify what I've been saying in this entire book. Though I've written about 500 pages, I couldn't write more than that. The idea of drawing this line between conciliation and compromise. Therefore, the CMP is a conciliatory document, and it's not a document of compromise. And that is true for the CMP, which happened even during the UPA 1 and UPA 2.
We know him from about him that he's a man of conciliation. But are there things that he was not able to, that he was struggling to, as a human being, as a human, from the human side point of view?
See, I think he wanted to do too many things, and at crucial stages, what happened is this losing out 10 years to AIDMK rule was a major setback. In fact, if that had not happened, I think Tamil Nadu would have been in a faster growth trajectory. In fact, if we look at it, we see a slowing down which happened around that time. And 1991, when India liberalized, if DMK had been in power till that point of time, the growth what we witnessed between 1991 and 2001, that decade growth would have been in a much, much faster bracket. But the crucial years have been lost. And I think he knew it more than anybody else that the crucial years have been lost. And the second loss was, see, what happened till 2001 is that the competitive politics of Tamil Nadu did not derail the earlier good projects. In fact, that complemented it in a far better manner. When MJR came to power, he did not dismantle the administrative reforms. Administrative reforms was actually carried out by his revenue minister, Mr. S.D. Somasundaram. There were certain things, despite the competitive politics, things were not buried fully. But those things started happening only with the Jayalalitha regime. With Jayalalitha regime, what happened is some of the finest moves were being completely destroyed. Whether it is the Anna Centenary Library or whether it's a Secretariat building. There were, if we are talking about the loss, there were two losses. First decade loss was 77-87 during his prime time. And by 77, he had also had this huge, wonderful experience. A lot of people don't realize that whenever Kalaignar has been part of a union government, he provides stability. In 1969, Mrs. Gandhi's government survived because Kalaignar provided the stability. In 1980, Mrs. Gandhi could come back to power because Kalaignar gave that idea of stability as a push. Therefore, here was a leader who was talking about the state rights, but who was also very clear that we need a stable matrix within which these rights have to be negotiated. Therefore, he was not looking at negotiating my rights in a weak template. He wanted a template which is robust and which can survive. And within a robust and surviving template, he wanted the rights. That's a most interesting combination of his politics.
Very true. So reading this book for me, it must have been a Herculean task. I must compliment you, congratulate you on that. But also reading the book, I realized what I did not know earlier. And this really clarifies a lot of things, even for people who know a little bit about the Dravidian movement, or even more about the Dravidian movement. There are several facts that actually clarify several ideas about the life of Karunanidhi. And the resources that there's always this complaint. There's no single book. There's no information about Dravidian movement or about his life or about the history of DMK or about what the contributions of DMK as a political party. So what do you think about that? What is your, as a journalist, as an author, having written this book, are you satisfied?
the first thing is I also bought that idea that there is very little about the movement. Then I realized that it is extremely unfair on the founding leaders of the movement because they were running their politics in Tamil Nadu and they were producing everything in Tamil. Their job is not to produce a book which can become an immediate footnote for somebody else's PhD thesis. Therefore, what happened is the idea of what can go into the PhD thesis in a ready-made formula was not given by the Dravidian movement. That was the only problem. But rest of the documents were there. In fact, more than any other movement, this movement produced more prolific people, and almost everybody wrote. For instance, there's a book called Malarga Manila Suyachi. It's by Kusa Anandan. That book has 13 introductions. It has an introduction by Kalaignar, Nerinjadian, Perasriyar, Sadiq Bacha, K. Santanam, Maposi, everybody. And each person was addressing one element of the center-state relation. Somebody was looking at the power to make laws, somebody was looking at the fiscal federal relations, somebody was looking at the way concurrent list has been used, somebody was looking at the state list not being wider enough. The way it was a very, very interesting one. Those 11 introductions gives us an idea of the composite nature in which people actually reflected at that point of time. And these reflections are in Tamil. The way if you want to write about Tamil Nadu, read in Tamil and get out all these materials. And next thing is certain things are getting lost in translation. We should also be able to negotiate that element. How to pull out what exactly it means without making it, for instance, this in Tamil, inam is different from race. In Tamil, inam is ethnicity. And in English, it can be race. Therefore, are we are talking about Dravidian ethnicity or we are talking about Dravidian race? Therefore, in these type of translation, it becomes much more difficult and also layered to bring out these distinctions. How are we going to look at linguistic groupings? Are the linguistic groupings, ethnicity, race, these words, how they get lost when we are trying to do the translation? In fact, when I was reading Mr. P. Ramamurthy's criticism of the Dravidian movement, I felt that half of the problem comes from superimposing a completely different English term for a specific Tamil term. I don't know whether I'm making sense, but that's where the problem lies.
Yeah, definitely, yes. And, reading this book again, I must tell you, if at all there was one unfortunate politician in independent India, it must be Kalaignar. Having done so much to the state, to his people, is still being misunderstood and unfortunately fallen prey to the narratives of the right wing, if I may say so. And I would encourage everyone to read this book. It's a very important book that every Tamil should have this book. And I must thank you and congratulate you for bringing this book the right time. I think this is the time people should buy it and read it very quickly. Yes, Panneer.
Sundar, more than anything else, I should thank you. You created the space for me to sit and finish the book. Thank you for creating that wonderful working space in your library. Only thing is, I slightly differ from your characterization. I don't think he's an unlucky person. He's a most lucky person. Actually, the people who respect him are more than the people who despise him. The people who despise him haven't grown in numbers over the period of time, but the people who like him have grown over the period of time. Therefore, if you are going to look at, say, the people who attacked him when Parasakti came in 1952, are the same number of people who are attacking him even today. But the people who are willing to look at him and understand his politics, it has grown much beyond. I have seen the entire Mandal politicians, starting from Lalu, Mulayam, and others, the amount of respect they have for him. I've seen it with Mr. Biju Patnaik as well as his son, Naveen, during the UF days. We have seen it with, look at the Congress leaders. Look at Dr. Manmohan Singh. Look at left leaders like Somnath Chatterjee. I think that the critics of Kalaignar in 1952 are the same today, but the admirers of Kalaignar has grown up. And interestingly, some of his critics, like Jayakanthan, later changes their position completely. And he says that you are such an important person. I got it wrong. And he says it publicly. I don't think Kalaignar is misunderstood. Kalaignar has been deliberately misinterpreted by some section.
Okay.
That is different. Those section is never going to interpret them properly.
Yes.
But the admirers are growing, and that is the most important one.
True. But I said that because the DMK was dismissed so many times, and that he was not able to do what he wanted to do.
Yes.
And that was the reason. It is out of that angst.
I understand your viewpoint fully.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Pani. It was really, really very interesting talking to you. And over to Mr. Pugal.
Thank you, Mr. Sundar. Thank you, Mr. Paneer. Now the floor is open for questions. One question, I just got a message from Jayshankar Venugopal. I'll just read out the question. Since his first term as CM, Kalaignar has always played convincing role in national politics. But what was the reason for a deliberate blackout, to a certain extent at least, about the achievements of Kalaignar by North Indian media? Did a coterie of elites actually put a spoke in Kalaignar taking PM job in the late 90s? How did he take it when he was not given the due he deserves in national politics?
In late 90s, if he had wanted, he could have become the Prime Minister. Between 1996 and 1998, during the UF days, I was reporting from Delhi. I have met him many times from the Tamil Nadu house. I was there with him when he was negotiating with others, both in the Bihar Bhavan as well as in the Andhra Bhavan. It was he who said that I'm not interested in becoming the PM. In fact, that was a very, very fine utterance, what he said. He said, "En uyaram enakku theriyum." And in fact, that "En uyaram enakku theriyum" statement of Kalaignar was the one which was used by some of the congressmen to say that he is mocking Mr. Moopanar's desire to become the Prime Minister. In fact, that distortion of his statement is the one which led to the TMC-DMK's relationship becoming what it was by 2001. But Kalaignar was very, very clear. And second, he felt that his politics is in the state. He had no illusions about that. We have to remember, Kalaignar was even suggested as a presidential candidate in the run-up to before V.V. Giri. It's been well documented. Just look at the writings of somebody like George Fernandez and team. They wrote it, and in fact, they wanted Kalaignar to become the presidential candidate. But that was too early. He said that I am not going to take up a job without addressing the political needs of my state. Therefore, it's a very, very, very considered position what he took. He felt that retaining the political power within the state is what he wanted, and he wanted the transformations here